thank you, Nicola and Chi Hyang, if I'm not pronouncing it too badly, for having me here and for having organized this wonderful workshop. I myself am expecting to learn a lot from our talks and discussions. I don't know much about, I know very little about Chinese philosophy, and I'm very eager to know more and to explore and discover what common philosophical ground and problems we all, despite the different philosophical traditions we work on, we can share. So I am also very happy that I am the first speaker, since for time constraints, I decided not to focus my talk on any specific author, nor on any specific issue raised by a specific text, because I thought that would have required too much background. But rather, I decided to opt for a more theoretical overview of some issues that I have encountered in my research, and that made me reflect about how we are to understand two radically opposed principles. So more specifically, I would like to point out and discuss with you some of the assumptions that we have, or that at least I had for certain, when we are to approach dualistic systems, as for instance, Platonism, and specifically discuss assumptions that, despite their intuitive plausibility, result to be much less grounded or much more difficult to be grounded once we look for a confirmation in the text. Now, I know that what I will say will probably be more fitting for Plato and ancient Platonism, and I'm not entirely sure that the same set of assumptions is either maintained, discussed, or consciously avoided by medieval authors, nor if similar discussions are or were ongoing in China. And I'm not even sure that the different frameworks allow for comparison between these traditions at all. My hope is, however, that this setting will help us to establish some common ground for discussion and understand if and to what extent these assumptions are equally shared by people working on dualistic systems that are others than the one I work on. So I hope this will set the ground for, this will help us having a first conversation across and beyond the different traditions. So the way I would like to tackle the problem is from a very theoretical perspective, which is, if you want, a matter of what are the implications of establishing an opposite pair of items, whatever these items are, which are radically antithetical from an ontological point of view, and how we are to understand this opposition. The assumption that I would like to challenge, or at least to discuss, is a very common one, and one which I also think that in many cases obtains. And yet it is precisely for this reason that, since it is very reasonable, we then take it for granted. The claim is the following. I want to discuss the claim that because of the radical opposition or antithesis between the two principles, whatever they are, or items, say, for instance, in my case, forms and sensibles, or body and souls, the features that connote each of these items are necessarily mutually exclusive. So in other words, if body and soul are, from an ontological perspective, radically different, given that body is something material, extended, and passive, then soul will be something immaterial, unextended, and active. And even more to that, given the passivity or inertness of matter or body, any activity that body or matter will be said to perform, and this will be due to the other principle which inhabits it, and not to body or matter itself. And the same for forms and sensibles. So if sensible objects are unstable, changeable, and in motion, then forms, as the true object of knowledge, will be stable, unchangeable, and immutable. Okay, as it is very clear from these examples, which I believe will be familiar to most of you, these implications not only appear to be often the case, but in most cases, they're also encouraged by primary sources, where it is very common that the source underlines the opposition in order to stress the different ontological order of matter and form. And yet sometimes when we take a closer look at the text, the fact that the opposed items do not or cannot share at all any feature is not always granted as one may expect. And in some cases, as I will hope to point out, I think it is more problematic than one would intuitively think. In my current research, I incurred in a few of these cases where a radical ontological opposition between two items does not necessarily imply radically different features for the items in questions. In other words, I realized that there were and there is some space for overlapping of these features, and that the lines are more blurred. And this made me reflect about how much we project onto these oppositions that we do not actually read from the text. Just to give you some background, my area of expertise is ancient Platonism, and more specifically, my research deals with the first generation of philosophers who succeeded Plato in the academy. And my postdoc project aims at clarifying the main elements of the psychological theories that the immediate successors of Plato set forward. About this topic, there is not much. Not much material has been preserved by the sources. And for this reason, at the beginning of my research, I had to go back and I wanted to get my Plato straight and be sure about what the basic features of, what are the basic features that Plato does ascribe to the soul. And besides the soul's immortality and self-movement, another notion which is very well established in the literature about Plato's soul is also that the soul is incorporeal. And in the end, this makes perfect sense. Plato often opposes the soul and the body. We can think of an argument in particular in the Phaedo, which is called the affinity argument, where in order to demonstrate the immortality of the soul, one argument puts forward is precisely this radical distinction between soul and body. So this assumption that the soul is incorporeal appears to be very well justified and very plausible. Since the soul is opposed to the body, it makes sense to think that it is not a body. And if it is not a body, it is natural to think that it is incorporeal. And you can imagine my surprise when I ran a first analysis of the text in order to find the most relevant passages that discuss these issues. And I realized that in the whole Platonic corpus, which is not exactly an inconspicuous one, I could not find one occurrence of the adjective asomatos, which literally means without body or incorporeal, that was explicitly referred to a notion of the soul that Plato would endorse. This made me reflect a lot about the theoretical setting of the opposition and of how much I was projecting onto it. And I would like to leave you with two very general considerations, which I hope can be of help to start a comparison or contrast between different frameworks. So when we reflect about the opposition between a material and another sort, whatever we call it, another form of principle, we often connote the characteristics of the second principle in a negative form. So one reason I think is very obvious, especially when we have matter as this first principle. So there is a number of very intuitively accessible criteria for corporeality. A body is something which is perceptible, mutable, subject to dissolution and destruction. And hence, when in need of describing something which is opposed to material, we most naturally change the features that we ascribe to matter and turn them in a negative form. So the other principle, the principle other than matter, will be imperceptible, immutable, imperishable. But these concepts, since they have their primary reference, they maintain that their primary reference for these concepts is matter, sometimes are hardly explanatory of what these adjectives actually mean. And I will give you an example about incorporeality in a second. I would just want to add that this process is also encouraged by our language, and the same holds for the Greek, which allows us to create negative forms of these adjectives by adding a suffix at the beginning of the adjective. This negative way to define most of the attributes, especially of the second principle, however, do not always help us clarify what this principle is. So it says what it is not, but not really what it is. I know absolutely nothing about Chinese grammar, and but for this reason, I would be very curious to understand how the principle other than matter is described, and if there is the same effort to describe it per via negativa, or if it is described with more explanatory adjectives. And an example of why I believe these adjectives sometimes may require careful consideration is because is, for example, provided by the notion of incorporeality. As I said, it's very easy to take for granted because I think it makes sense to take it for granted. One would want it to be very explicit in the text. So the soul, insofar as it is opposed to the body in a dualistic system such as Platonism, is intuitively thought to be incorporeal, and maybe it is, but Plato does not put forward it in such an explicit way. And so how to account for the fact that Plato never advances such an explicit description for the soul? So soul should, in principle, belong to the order of those things which are asomata, so without body, as in fact forms clearly and explicitly are. And yet some of its features, as for example, the fact that in the Timaeus it is more explicitly said to be extended, bring it closer, or bring it closer to a concept of a body, maybe not the body that we have, but surely not so decent as one may think. Obviously, there is not one way to solve the issue, but I offer one possibility, one possible solution that I think can help us reflect about this opposition more, and which does maintain the ambiguity and a difference between the two terms. So one problem, I think, and I don't know if this is the same for other systems, may arise from an intuitive identification of of immaterial and incorporeal, which is encouraged by the frequent reduction of body to matter. Yet the negations of these two terms, I believe, do not carry the same implications. Something which is without matter, I think, is not necessarily not a body. If being incorporeal, I think, carries with it being also immaterial as an implication. I don't think that the converse is necessarily the case. So let me give you an example so that it becomes a bit easier. I think that if we think, for example, that a minimal requirement for a body is to be something extended, then nothing at all excludes that there can be a body which has no matter. And if this still is difficult to conceptualize, I think we may think of geometrical bodies, or the way in which Euclid defines a solid, geometrical solid, which all go in the direction of connoting it as extended. So in this sense, nothing excludes that the soul, if we want to give an explanation that maintains this difference, could maintain its radical opposition with the body, maybe precisely insofar as it is without matter, which in fact makes it imperceptible, indivisible, unseeable, and so on. But that body and soul, insofar as somehow both are extended, may, to a certain extent, share the characteristic of being some sort of bodies, so that there is some sort of degree among which we can move, and not a radical exclusion of one of these terms, which I think is the way in which later traditions, both in the academy and the Stoics, then will continue to work on this kind of concept. I would like to conclude very, I didn't count on my time, but I think I have time for one small comment. Of course, given the nature of my research, I concentrated more on the principle other than matter, but I do think that there are reasons to expect similar things about the material principle too, when it is also described in a negative way. So when it is inert, passive, or this kind of adjectives, I think that also may allow for more investigation. Okay, thank you.